There's a feeling that I want you to recognize because once you do, you're going to start to see it everywhere. It's the feeling of doing something small and noticing afterward that it changed how you felt about yourself for the rest of the day. You answered an email 5 minutes faster than you needed to, or you said one honest sentence in a meeting instead of staying silent, or you went to bed a little earlier instead of scrolling on your phone. None of these things are big, and none of them would make it onto a resume for sure, but somehow you carry yourself differently for the rest of the day because of them. Now, that feeling is the entire subject of this episode because here's what I know to be true after years of watching careers rise and stall up close. Nobody's career is typically built in the big moments, the dramatic moments, the promotion announcement, the big keynote, the big deal they closed. Those are the visible peaks. But what determines whether you ever reach those peaks is almost always 1,000 small choices that nobody else ever sees. And you make them on an ordinary Monday, an ordinary Tuesday. They compound, though, steadily in a direction that you may not even be tracking. I used to believe, like so many people do, that careers are built by a handful of big bets, that bold move, that brave conversation, that big leap. And those moments, they matter. They genuinely do matter. But I've come to believe something different now, something more practical and actionable. It's something that you can move forward on every day instead of waiting for that big, rare, dramatic opportunity to present itself, because those are the things that lead to those opportunities. We're talking about here the small choices that build big careers. And we're going to look at the science of how tiny actions compound into identity, into how you're seen. A specific piece of research, architecture, that is going to change how you think about your own daily decisions. That's something we're going to go into. And a second body of research on what actually drives daily motivation at work, which turns out to be connected to all of this in a way that most people never even realize. We're also going to look at a practical system for making the small choices work in your favor, starting tomorrow morning. So let's get into it. Here's the trap that most ambitious professionals fall into, and I fell into it myself years before I understood what was actually happening. We tend to evaluate our process in big units. Did I get the promotion? Did I land the account? Did I give the standout presentation? And when none of those big units are happening in a given week or a given month, it's easy to feel like nothing is happening at all, like you're standing still and the months are passing without producing anything that you could point to. But that's actually not how careers are built. And it's not how trust or skill or reputation get built. They're built the way a riverbed gets carved. Not by one dramatic flood necessarily, but by water moving across the same stone in the same direction over and over and over again. Each individual pass looks like nothing. The cumulative effect, though, it reshapes the whole landscape. And it's so gradual that nobody standing nearby would even notice it happening in real time. And it happens so completely that by the time anyone does notice, the change just, in hindsight, it looks inevitable, even though it never felt that way while it was occurring. The professionals who advanced fastest are very rarely the ones who made one brilliant decision. They tend to be the ones who made hundreds of slightly better decisions than the people around them. And they did it consistently, in moments way too small for anyone, including themselves, to notice in real time. That's the really interesting part, and maybe the unsettling part here, because that work that actually builds a career, it doesn't really feel like building anything at all while it's happening, which is what makes it so sneaky, and people tend to miss it. The science here bears looking at because it explains exactly why small choices carry so much more weight than we instinctively give them credit for. James Clear, who spent years researching habit formation, built his whole framework around a single, deceptively simple idea. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. Goals are about the results you want. Systems are about the process that produces the results. And what his research consistently shows is that the people who actually achieve meaningful change, they're almost never the ones with the most inspiring goals. They're the ones with the most consistent systems operating underneath their goals. They're unseen, they're doing the actual work of change, one small action, one small repetition at a time. There's a specific finding from his work that really stays with me. He describes habits as compounding interest for self improvement, the same way that money multiplies through compound interest. Improving by just 1% isn't particularly noticeable on any given day. It might even be invisible. But over the course of a year, those 1% improvements compound into something close to 37 times better than where you started. Not 37% better, 37 times better. The math of compounding is deeply counterintuitive because our brains are built to evaluate linear progress, not exponential progress. And small, consistent gains, those are exponential. They're not linear. Now, here's the part of the research that I find even more useful and fascinating for our purposes today. And it comes from a related field called choice architecture. And that's the study of how the structure of our decisions shapes the outcomes that we end up with, often without our conscious awareness. Researchers studying decision making have found that the environment around a choice, what's easy, what's nearby, what requires the least friction, predicts behavior far more reliably than willpower or motivation. People don't mostly choose based on what they want the most. They choose based on what's most available in the moment that the decision has to be made. So let's take that and apply that to your career. If speaking up in meetings is something that you have to talk yourself into every single time through sheer willpower, you're not going to do it. You're going to do it rarely. And no matter how much you want to be that person who speaks up. But if you build a small structure around it, if you build a single phrase you've decided in advance that you're going to say in every meeting, even just one observation, the friction drops dramatically and the behavior becomes far more likely to actually happen. That is what choice architecture means in practice. You're not relying on having to have enough courage in the moment. You're designing the moment ahead of time so that courage barely needs to be involved at all. This reframes the entire question of career growth. The professionals who seem to have more discipline or more courage or more consistency than everyone else, they usually don't have more willpower. They've simply designed better systems, ones that make the right small choice the easy choice, almost automatically for them, removing the need for being a hero on a daily basis. And then there's a second body of research that completes the picture because it explains not just why small choices compound, but why they feel so good once you start noticing them, which is a separate question and a very important question. Researchers studying motivation and progress, especially Teresa Amabile's work at Harvard Business School, spent years analyzing thousands of diary entries from professionals across dozens of companies, tracking their moods and their motivation and their sense of progress day by day. And what they found, published as the progress principle, was that the single most powerful driver of positive emotion and motivation at work was not the big wins, the recognition, the external reward, all those things that we would expect it to be. It was not that. What it was the simple daily experience of making progress on meaningful work, even in very small increments. And here's the detail that I find the most useful. The researchers found that minor setbacks had a disproportionately larger negative effect on mood than equivalent minor wins had a positive effect, which tracks with what we know about loss aversion more broadly. But here's the encouraging twist. Small wins, tracked and noticed consistently, were powerful enough to outweigh that asymmetry over time, as long as people were actually registering those small wins as progress rather than letting them pass by unnoticed. And this is significant because it means that the small choices we've been talking about, they aren't just building your career in some abstract sense, some long-term sense. They are, in the short term, the single most reliable lever for your daily motivation and your sense of momentum. The two effects reinforce each other. Small choices build the identity that builds the career. But noticing those small choices builds the daily motivation that makes you more likely to keep making them. It's a loop. And once it's running in your favor, it sustains itself with far less effort than you'd think. Now, I want to pause here and look at the other side of this because compounding cuts both directions, and the negative version deserves just as much attention as the positive one, maybe more, since it's the one that's operating on most people's lives and people's careers without their awareness. Just like small, brave choices compound into a more capable, more visible version of you, small, avoidant choices compound into the opposite. The meeting where you let your idea go unsaid because someone else was already talking. The email you decided not to send because it felt like too much trouble. The slightly easier task that you chose over the slightly harder one that would have actually stretched you. None of these choices feel consequential by themselves. That's exactly the problem. They're designed by their very smallness to escape your notice. So picture this as the shadow version of that riverbed. The same mechanism, water moving across stone, repeated over and over and over again, except now it's carving a channel in the opposite direction, toward avoidance, toward the path of least resistance, toward becoming smaller than larger over time. And because each individual path looks so harmless, almost nobody notices the channel that's being carved until they're standing in it. Days, weeks, months, years later, wondering how they ended up so far from where they wanted to go. So here's what makes this especially dangerous for truly capable people. Talent and intelligence, they can mask the early effects of this shadow compounding for a very long time. You can coast on raw ability for years while the small avoidant choices accumulate underneath the surface, mostly invisible because your results still look fine from the outside. And then, without warning, you hit a level where your ability alone is no longer sufficient, where the role really requires the muscle that you've spent years not building, one small choice at a time. And the gap becomes suddenly visible, unhappily visible, all at once. This is why I want you to think about today's practice, not just as building something new, but as actually redirecting a channel that may already be carved in the wrong direction. That's not a discouraging thought. This is actually a hopeful thought because if the channel was carved by repeated small choices, just think, it can be recarved the exact same way. Water finds a new path the moment you consistently send it somewhere different. So I want to talk you through what this actually looks like for someone because the theory only becomes useful once you set it in motion. I had a client who came to me convinced that she had a confidence problem. She would describe herself almost word for word, the same way in every session. I'm just not someone who pushes myself forward. She would watch peers with objectively less experience get more visibility, more opportunities, and she would conclude inside her head that it was because they were naturally bolder and naturally more confident, built differently than she was built. But when we dug underneath the surface at her week, hour by hour, what we found was not a confidence problem. It was a structural problem. She had built an entire week of small, invisible choices that consistently favored staying in the background. She would schedule herself last on meeting agendas by habit, not by necessity. She would send her best ideas to her manager privately by email instead of raising them aloud in the room where the credit actually gets assigned. She would let other people finish their thought before she would add hers every single time, even when her thought was the more important one, simply because waiting felt safer in the moment. Now, none of these were big choices. None of them were really even conscious choices. They were just the habitual architecture of her week built up over years. one small choice, habitual choice, at a time, until the architecture itself had become the explanation that everyone, including her, mistook for her personality. So we didn't try and overhaul her confidence directly. We just changed the structure, small structural choices. She moved herself earlier on the agenda when she had the option. She committed to saying at least one idea out loud in every meeting. She was asked to lead a cross-functional initiative, something that would have been unthinkable to her a year earlier. It was the kind of thing that she would have assumed that was reserved for all those naturally confident people, those naturally bold people that she used to compare herself to. Well, when I asked her what she thought was different and what felt different, she didn't describe feeling suddenly confident or suddenly fearless. She described something so simple. She described it as familiar. Speaking up had simply become something that she did, the way that brushing her teeth was something that she did. It wasn't like something that required a pep talk from her anymore. That is the actual marker of that change, that channel change, that identity change. It's not the absence of fear, it's the absence of the internal negotiation that she used to always have to have if she was going to try to make herself speak up. That choice had stopped being a choice at all. It just became simply what she did. So, why does this work at a level deeper than habit formation alone? Because this is the part that actually matters most for how you see each other. So, we're talking about habit formation, but let's go even deeper than that, because this is the part that really matters most for how you see yourself. Every small choice you make is also a small vote for the kind of person that you believe yourself to be. And this is something that James Clear's research touches on directly. The idea that habits aren't just about results, they are about identity. Each time you choose the slightly braver option, even in a moment that's so small, no one else is going to notice, you are casting a vote. You're casting a vote for, I am someone who, in this case, speaks up. Each time, on the other hand, that you choose the safer option, the more, say, withdrawn option, you are casting a vote again, but this time for the opposite identity. It's not any one single vote that determines the outcome, but over months and years, the votes accumulate into a verdict, no question. And then you actually come to believe it. And it's just because the evidence keeps piling up in one direction. And this is why dramatic, one-time acts of courage aren't the ones typically that create that lasting change on their own. A single bold moment is one vote. It feels significant in the moment, but statistically, it barely moves the needle, barely moves the total. What actually shifts your identity and your career is that unglamorous repetition of slightly better choices made so consistently that eventually they stop requiring any effort at all, and they simply become who you are. So, why does this matter beyond the next promotion? This is worth thinking about. The version of you that exists right now, in a very real sense, it's the sum total of every small choice you've made up to this point. Not your intentions, not the person you meant to become, the small accumulated result of thousands of ordinary moments, most of which you don't even remember making. And that can sound a little unsettling for some of us if we frame it that way, but I would offer you the opposite read. This is actually enormously freeing and enormously empowering because it means that the person you become from here forward, well, that's available to you, equally available, equally buildable, starting with whatever choice is sitting in front of you today. You're not negotiating with a fixed personality. You're negotiating with a pattern, and patterns can be redirected the same way they were built, one small choice at a time. So let's make this practical, because I don't want to leave you with just theory. First, pick one identity, not a list of changes. Don't try to become a different person in 12 different ways simultaneously. Choose one specific identity you want evidence for. I am someone who speaks up in meetings. Or I am someone who follows through on commitments without being chased. Just pick one. Specificity here really matters because vague identities produce vague behaviors. I want to be more confident it's not going to cut it. It doesn't give you anything to actually do tomorrow morning. I am someone who shares my perspective before the meeting ends, gives you something concrete to point to, something concrete to succeed at, and something concrete to do, to repeat again and again. Secondly, lower the friction on the behavior that proves that thing, that identity. So look at your week and ask yourself where the friction currently sits. Or are you positioning yourself at the edges by habit? It's these small structural shifts, sitting closer to the front, don't sit in the back, scheduling yourself earlier in the meeting, drafting your point before the meeting starts so you're ready rather than forcing yourself to try to improvise under pressure. These are the things that remove the need for willpower, and not to mention stress, in the actual moment. The goal here of removing friction is to make the proving behavior, the proving that new identity, the path of least resistance, not the path that requires you to talk yourself into it every single time. Make it easy for yourself. Third, track the small votes, not the big outcomes. Most people only feel progress when something huge happens. They get the promotion, they get the recognition. Well, you're not going to do that. You are going to build a different practice instead. At the end of each day, you're going to ask yourself one question. Did I cast a vote today for the person that I'm trying to become? Now, some days the answer is going to be yes in a tiny, unremarkable way, and that is enough. That's actually the whole game. I would encourage you to write these down somewhere, even briefly. Get a journal to track these wins, to track these votes toward that identity. Because the act of recording a small win, it makes it count in a way that just remembering it usually doesn't. Memory is unreliable and biased toward the dramatic. A written record is unbiased. Fourth, expect the invisible middle. There's going to be a stretch, maybe a long stretch, where nothing visible seems to be happening, where you're making the small choices and no one around you has noticed yet. Well, that is normal, and it's actually the most important part of the entire process. The riverbed doesn't look different after one pass of the water. It looks identical for a while, maybe a long while, right up until eventually it doesn't. Most people quit during that same stretch. And it's not because things aren't working, the system isn't working. It's just because they can't see it. It's not working visibly yet. And they mistake invisible progress for no progress. Don't make that mistake. The middle is where the actual carving happens, even though it's the part that offers you the least feedback. Stick with it. The career you're building right now, ultimately, it's not being built by the big visible moments. It's not being built by these dramatic scenes. It's being built by the small, unglamorous choices you're making this week, the choices that nobody's going to put in a performance review, the choices that feel individually like they don't even matter, and yet they do. And they matter not because any single one of them is dramatically decisive, but because each one is a vote. And those votes are already accumulating into the verdict that you're going to eventually be known by, whether you're paying attention to that process or not. So here's your assignment. This week, choose one identity you want more evidence for. Just one. Just choose one thing. Then identify a single, small, structural change, something about timing or positioning or sequence that would make the proving behavior easier rather than harder. And then at the end of each day this week, ask yourself just one question. Did I cast a vote today for the person I am aiming to become? Small choices, repeated consistently. Those are how big careers actually get built.